mean, I'm not really in the business of telling people what things should or shouldn't be, but I mean, I think that there are ways to think about it that are more helpful as a reader and also probably as a writer too. I mean, most poets have an instinctive sense of why they're doing what they're doing and kind of what they're trying to do, even if they can't really articulate it. That's an impulse. But I do think a lot of confusion happens for readers because they're not really sure what to do when they're sitting in front of a poem or hearing one or whatever. They're like, just wait, this is I know I'm supposed to be doing something different, but what is it? And that's tough. That's, a hard problem to discuss. But I was thinking about this earlier and like really trying to break it down to its most elemental form, right? And I was thinking about what is the impulse that causes us to make anything? Like, why do we make anything, whether it's a poem or a drawing or, writing a novel like you do or a story? And it's like, there are many different possible impulses, but there's like a force that happens. Like you want to do something with the world, in interaction with the world. Maybe you want to change the world. Maybe you want to express yourself. Maybe you want to be seen. You want to reach out to another person, all those things. And I think with most forms of art, it's a little clearer why the person might be doing it than in poetry, and I think that's one thing that's like hard about poems is like, why is this person even talking to me? Like, what do they want from me? And I think the answer is obviously different for different people. And I think as we go talk about specific poems today, we'll be able to get into that deeper. But to me, it's really the impulse is to reach for something that can't be said in any other way, basically. Like I can't get to this feeling. I can't reach you, Brad, or you, stranger out there, or beloved, or whatever, if I can't reach you through a story. I can't tell a story, or I can't just speak like kind of just tell you what I was thinking like in my head, and I won't be able to get across something essential about myself and my experience. So I need to do it in this form of a poem. Now that doesn't really narrow things down too much, but I think it helps me, like when I'm thinking about poetry, to think this person's trying to reach me, and they're trying to reach me in a way that is strange, that feels different to me. And that's okay. Because in fact, they're trying to probably reach me with their strangeness, with their like intimate strangeness, and all this is kind of abstract, but like, I really think that as we go talk about some specific poems, we'll be able to see how that how what I'm saying has like practical effects in the choices that you make when you're writing a poem,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think it brings up a question about poetry and something that I've heard more than once, that some poetry is like so impenetrable that the criticism is that, if you're trying to reach a reader, you've got to let them in a little bit. And, I think what you're saying is that this intimate strangeness that poetry offers to greater and lesser degrees is like one of its virtues. Like, is there a line past which you can't go with a poem, like where it's just so impenetrable and abstract that you feel like maybe the job of communicating with a reader has been like shirked a little bit?
I mean, again, I just come back to the fact that different people have different, for lack of a better word, agendas when they're writing a poem. And sometimes their main agenda isn't to communicate something. Like they don't have even an idea necessarily. They're trying to create an experience. It's like, the analogy that people often use is, the difference between abstract art and representational art, and really the only way you can appreciate and fall in love with abstract art is to go to it with a different expectation than you go to with a representational piece of art. Now, you might do that and still not like Rothko or, whatever Cy Twombly. You might be like, this just isn't for me, which is fine. But at least you're kind of going with an openness that maximizes the chance that you might have a meaningful experience with it. And I think standing in front of an abstract art piece and trying to decipher and find out, well, that looks like a cowboy and that looks like this, and this is really about a weather system or whatever. Like, that's the surest way to kill your experience with it. I think you have to do something different when you're standing. And the same thing is true for some kinds of poetry. And again, some people might like, that's not for me. I don't want to do that. and that's fine. But like, at least you're going with, yeah, like I said, you're maximizing the chance that you might, I don't personally want to write that kind of poetry just because that doesn't activate me as a person. I don't want to do that. But people who do, I'm like, go for it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a conversation for this program with Sebastian Smee, the art critic for the Washington Post and the author of a book on the birth of Impressionism that we talked about. And I was asking him about his job, and I was asking him about just the experience of visual art and going into a gallery or a museum and how I tend to behave, which is to walk probably too quickly through the museum and or like maybe to self-consciously stand in front of a great painting and like try to like have a moment with it, but also to be running a commentary in my head about that very moment. And like, what am I supposed to
describing Ben Lerner's first novel right there? Like, that's essentially what happens for half of
like,
it.
What am I supposed to be doing here? And I think maybe in the literary sense, or like the best literary corollary for that experience of, museum going or standing in front of a painting is to sit in front of a poem and to try to really see it and to try to really sit with it. Does that square?
Oh, totally. And that is I think that's such a good analogy because the sort of putting of poetry into a museum in that way, figuratively speaking, has done a lot of damage to it. I have a friend who, she's a poet, and she puts poems up in different parts of her house. So she just walks by them like in the course of her daily life. And that's how she'll read, not her own poems, but other people's poems. And so they don't, so like, she'll just like when she's like at the refrigerator or something, there's like a poem like sitting there like on the refrigerator door, or like maybe it's like on her kitchen table or something. And so she'll read it kind of in the course of her life. So it doesn't have that like, it's not laden with all that significance. And, if you were able somehow to put the Mona Lisa in your kitchen, or a Picasso or whatever, like you'd have such a different kind of experience with it because it'd be embedded in your daily life, and you'd bounce off it, and you'd have like 3 seconds to look at it one time. And maybe you'd stop and look at it for too long at another because you actually didn't want to get to the next task or whatever, and you'd absorb it in a different kind of way. And I think it would probably mean more to you than just going to a museum and staying there and staring at it and being like, I know I'm supposed to be having an experience. It's hard. It's like too much pressure.
I read a essay. It was like an essay / like op-ed. It was in a newspaper, and I'm forgetting who wrote it and where exactly it was. But
what's a newspaper, Brian? I'm not familiar.
It's this thing that used to be delivered to your door, made of paper.
Oh, wow, weird. Okay.
Yeah, it was lovely, but
sounds great.
Basically, the author was arguing that the memorization of poetry is a very useful practice. And it's like to have a poem for different life circumstances, like committed to memory. So you experience a very difficult loss. You have a poem in your head that you know by heart that you can go to, or you're witnessing something beautiful in nature, or you're witnessing the birth of a child. There's another poem that you've memorized that really is meaningful to you. And this person was talking about how they had undertaken this practice. And I was like, man, that seems like a good thing to do. And of course, I haven't done it yet, but it struck me.
I mean, it sounds good. I mean, as a dad, and your dad, can you imagine if your child was being born and you started like reciting some Robert Frost poem or something?
Your wife,
like straight. I mean, I don't actually know. Like, I feel like if I'm experiencing something that's really meaningful, I don't actually want to like have another voice in my head, like kind of interpreting. I probably just want to. It'd be more like if I'm bored out of my mind waiting in line at the post office or something. That's when I'd probably want to like have a poem to memorize, say aloud in my head or something like that. Or if I'm just like, instead of looking at the internet or something like that, not when I'm having a meaningful experience, but I don't know. I mean, hey, whatever works for people is fine.
Just for all the men listening out there whose wives are pregnant, make sure to have that poem committed to memory and to recite it during contractions. I think it'll go over really well.
Yeah, I feel like a limerick, like there was from Attacca, or maybe like something would be real big hit in there in the birthing room. So
nothing better than a limerick.
We're here to serve. We're here to help.
Yeah. So I want to talk about like how a poem comes to be, and it's obviously, like you say, it's an intuitive process for poets. And I'm sure it's it's individual and specific to each poet's life and creative process. But are there any, common denominators that you can locate between poets in terms
Yeah.
of how these things happen?
Well, I'm going to say something really basic that I think is actually helpful, which is it's primarily linguistic. It's not, the impulse to make a poem is the impulse to make something in language. And it's not to make something with paint. It's not to make something with, your guitar. It's not to make something, it's not to make a dance, and it's not the urge to build like a beautiful, chair or something. It's the urge to make something with words. And it's but the urge to make something with words that isn't really, again, primarily about telling a story, although narrative, of course, is a part of poetry, but it's not, I mean, you're a novelist. Your impulse is a storytelling impulse. I don't think that's that's not, I don't sit down and write a poem and think I want to tell a story, but I want to do something with words, that will reach you and will reach me, reach inside myself too, that isn't really primarily a narrative impulse or like even a necessarily an explanatory impulse. Like I write essays, I write whole books of prose when I want to explain something. But again, that's not really the impulse behind writing a poem for me. It's something else that has to do with finding something as I write, And so I think the twin impulses of the very most basic impulses of poetry are probably, again, that it is language based inquiry, and that it is an inquiry. It's a discovery. It's not a telling of something you already know, and it's a finding of something. And that's one of the best things about poems, I think, for me, is as I'm reading them, I'm following along with someone as they're discovering something. And that's the thing. That's like the buzz of the poetry. That's the joy of writing it. And that's the buzz and the joy of reading it, is you sort of suddenly start to kind of like track along with and even be weirdly like sort of haunted by someone's mind as they're like making their way through something, and you're kind of doing it with them. And again, that's like, if you don't like a poem, a lot of the time it's just because you don't really vibe with the way someone's mind is moving that much. It's like you meet people and you're like, okay, I don't think that person's a bad person. They're just not someone I really want to hang out with. They're not, I don't vibe with them or whatever. But then somebody you do, I'm using vibe like I'm like 30 years younger than I am, by the way. I'm 15% sure what that means. But I mean, like, you're not connecting, or you're just not feeling that comfortable around them, I guess. And like, but some people you just, you read their poems, and it's like an old friend. And the weird thing is they might be somebody who, like some of my best old friends who are poets are, Chinese poets from the 9th century, Li Po and Tu Fu. I mean, I have nothing in common with those people other than being a human being, and a father. But like,
what is it about their poetry that gets you?
I don't know, because it's also in translation, so it's kind of very that's a whole complicated other discussion. But there's something about the way that they are seeing the world and sort of processing it that in a way like where I feel sort of weirdly like I know them, and they know me. And of course, that's not true. And again, we could talk about how much that has to do with the translations, but I've read enough of it, and I've read enough of it in translation, and also I've read enough of it in just like very literal translation to know that there's just something about the way the mind is moving, of poets who wrote at that particular era, which happened to be on the verge of a giant civil catastrophe, which is a little chilling to think about. but I think the way that they're sort of they're living in a time of like provisional stability. That too probably has something to do with it, but. Anyway, I don't know. I mean, that's for me. That's what but somebody else might be like, oh, I connect so much with, something else, and that's cool.
Well, I want to ask you, I like this idea of the creation of poetry being a process of inquiry. It's like linguistic, and it's also a process of inquiry and discovery in the act of writing itself. So I'm just wondering if part and parcel to that, there is some kind of core question that tends to animate your creative process as a poet. Like, is the inquiry like blind? Like you're just like, I want to see what I find when I just start putting words on the page and like figure out what I'm thinking? Or do you have something that's bothering you that's explicit, or like some sort of mystery or question or difficulty that you then try to like tease apart in poetry?
See, I feel like we're actually now really talking about it. Like actually, that question is like a great question because like what actually is happening to someone when they sit down to write a poem, and why is it that they're pushed to writing a poem as opposed to an essay or a novel or something? And I think you're right that there's something essentially something bothering, and maybe not even necessarily in a negative way, like sort of like creating some kind of like impulse to engage, maybe. And that you know, it can be something specific, like it can be actually like a thing, like this is bothering me, or I think this is funny, or like I think this is weird, and like no one seems to have ever talked about this, like you and I think you're going to talk about one of the poems in my new book called Jury Duty. And I was just thinking about, wow, like what is that actually? Like you know, what that civic, a weird civic moment, you know. I was like, I just had the instinct of like that if I sort of went in that direction, that there would be something there that could be discovered, you know. But it can be also sometimes something as simple as the urge to just talk to someone who's not there, to reach them, you know, either because they're dead or because they're far away, or just because they're, you know, like maybe my wife, you know, like I just want to say something to her, and I don't know exactly what I want to say, but I feel like there's something I need to say, you know, and I'll only know if I write the poem. And then sometimes it's way more just like, oh, this word is kind of interesting to me, or this image, or I heard these sounds, like this group of words. Like my third book is called Come On All You Ghosts. And what happened in that book is that I was doing a lot of traveling at the time. I was flying back and forth from a job I had in Houston, teaching. And I was I was doing so much traveling, I started to kind of like hallucinate almost. And one time I saw Flavor Flav in the airport, in the Houston airport, with a clock around his neck, and I was like, "Am I actually seeing? Like, is that really Flavor Flav?" And then I get on the plane, and Carlos Santana is sitting in the first class, like reading a book. I was like, "I don't know, man. I don't know if it's actually happening."
If he'd had a clock around his neck, then it would have gotten really weird.
Yeah, I would have been like, "No, no, no." Yeah, he was like, 911 is a joke, man. But I started to hear this phrase, "Come on, all you ghosts," like in my head. I don't know where it came from. And I was like, I Googled it. I was like, is this something? And nowhere. And I think it was just like some phrase that just started to like echo in my brain. And I don't know why. And I like had to pursue it, you know, to write a poem. And like that can happen too to people. It's like a material interest, in the same way that like a painter might get super obsessed with a color, or you might just get obsessed with a moment of narrative. Like you see a scene. Does that happen to you? Like as a novelist, do you like see a scene and you don't know why it's important?
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, I mean, and then what do you do if you just see that scene? Like, what do you do about it?
Like obsess about it. The word obsess is.
But then what? Like after, like
commit it to the page in some form and try to figure out why.
Right. The same thing. It's like, yeah, but for a poet, the unit is more often going to be on the phrasal, the imagistic, or even the word or sound level. That's just like, that's the difference between writing a poem. It's like way more materially based. It's not quite as conceptual or bigger. I mean, it can be, but it's like, it tends toward the smaller unit of beginning, I guess, in poets generally. So there's that, but yeah.
And I think like what I'm hearing you say is that, you know, often it's linguistic, it's a word, it's a phrase, but it could be an image, it could be an experience. There's all sorts of different ways that a poem can originate. And
it could even be a big idea. Not to interrupt you. It's like, it could be a big idea. It could, or even could be a narrative moment like what we were just talking about. And that's not like against the rules or something. It's just those things, the bigger it gets, the harder it is to keep it from sort of like, the harder it is to keep the focus on the language. The bigger the thing is, like whether it's a scene or a big, huge idea, the language tends to, your priority tends to become something more conceptual or something more didactic or explanatory, and you can lose your focus on the individual words. And I think when you're reading a poem, it's like you feel the energy of focus on particular words, like a kind of slowness and a precision, you know.
Yeah, it seems like, I mean, it seems similar to like how in the writing of fiction, it's typical for like the big idea, like those kinds of underpinnings to emerge later in the process rather than at the outset. It's too much pressure to, I mean, some people do it that way, but to me, it's like, Jesus, it's hard enough, you know, but to begin with this big idea and to feel, you know, to tell yourself that you've got to somehow crystallize it in a fiction, like maybe puts too much pressure on the process.
I think it's, and I mean, I think it's totally okay if that's what gets you writing. But I think the most important quality you have to have as a poet is flexibility. You know, you got to be willing to be like, actually, this poem isn't about what I thought it was about. And actually, like that line that started it wasn't, it just was like the starter, like whatever, the sourdough starter, again, to talk about something I have no idea about. But like, you know, that was just like the thing that got things, the booster rocket, you know, it's going to fall away back into the atmosphere and it doesn't matter. Like you can't be attached. You got to be really flexible, I think, when you're writing a poem, you know, because otherwise it's like you're too rigid about it. And then human beings are so interesting, you know, like they have such weird ideas. Like the second people start thinking or talking about something, like they come up with all these bizarre associations and connections. And if you kind of like forbid yourself to go there as a writer and you're like, no, the subject of this poem is, you know, I don't know, the election or whatever. And then when you have some weird association with like, you know, the spaghetti you had as a kid or something or whatever, or like your favorite, like kind of like candy or whatever, something, you're like, no, that's not what this is about. I'm going to stay in it. And I think that's like not a good mentality when you're writing a poem, you know, because it's the very detours that are actually the thing that are they're always the things people like the best, you know, the detours.
Yeah. And those like weird juxtapositions and associations, and that's part of the fun. And I think
know why that is? It's because making metaphors is to connect things that don't belong or seem like they don't belong, and then to reveal their connections. So the metaphor, and as we know, like from Aristotle, from the very beginning of talking about writing in the Western world, at least, like, you know, making metaphors is what poets do. And so you need to have a metaphorical mindset as you write a poem, even if you're not just making metaphors, but you need to have a connecty, associative openness, or you have a tendency to be writing something else. You know, like which is fine. Write something else then. You know, like maybe write an essay, or maybe write a novel. That's great too. I mean, I love essays and novels. You know, like, but I just, you know, I think sometimes people are trying to write a novel. They think they're writing a poem, but they're really trying to write a story. You know.
Well, when it comes to this process of inquiry and the drafting of a poem, you know, you just kind of touched on this, but I want to get into it a little bit more deeply, which is to say I want to talk about like the revision of a poem, because there's a lot of mystery to the process, and you're asking questions and you're kind of searching your way through a poem. And you said just a moment ago, like, you have to be open and you have to allow for these unlikely associations and metaphors to emerge, and you have to permit yourself that kind of creative freedom. Can you just talk a little bit about how you start from sort of line one and then eventually land on the finished version, and like what that looks like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I wrote a whole book about this, you know, where the last book of prose I published was that book, Story of a Poem, which begins with me writing, you know, starting a poem with a few lines, and then the book kind of traces the writing of that one poem, although it veers off into writing of other poems and many other things. But, you know, it's really kind of like trying to slow down and reveal that entire process as much as possible in one instance, you know, which would be, you know, for me something, and would be for a different person a different thing. But I think, you know, basically what happens is that I start somewhere and I really try to think to myself, I want to be present. Like whatever I write or whatever I say, I want to think about like what that suggests and what would come next and what would come next. You know, it's like I always think about like a rat in the maze, like looking for the cheese, you know? And like, that's kind of how I am with a poem. I'm like, okay, like that step didn't result in me banging my head against a wall. What's the next step? You know, what's the next step? What's the next step? And you know, I'll wander down something, and then I'll run into a wall, and I'll be like, wait, that actually isn't interesting, or that's not, like, there's nothing there. I'm just babbling. You know, I'm not saying anything interesting, or I'm repeating myself, so I got to back out. And then, so the revision process that you're talking about is me kind of like backing myself out of that, cutting off 1 or 2 or 5 or 10 lines and backing up to like, wait, where did this go wrong? You know? And the difference, you know, what I tell my students this all the time, I'm like, I've been doing this for so many decades that I'm quicker at noticing when I've gone into a cul-de-sac, and I'm quicker at identifying the moment when I entered the cul-de-sac. And that's just a matter of experience. That's not me being more talented than them. It's just I've done it so many goddamn times. I've made so many mistakes that I'm like, oh yeah, that's the thing where I like, thought I was being funny, or like, or picked the wrong thing to emphasize or something. You must relate to this as a novelist too, right? Where you're like, you go down some garden path about like some scene or something. You spend like 5 days trying to write something. And you're like, wait,
Yeah.
does that happen to you?
Yeah, of course. And I think it's like quicker recognition, but it's also comfort with the failure because you've done it so many times. I think that's a good lesson for people out there who might be earlier in their careers or earlier in the process. The quicker you can make more mistakes, the better things will probably be, right?
Fail better, right? That's
yeah.
what like Beckett said. But also just like, it's really hard. I mean, again, I've been told my students this a lot, like if you haven't had a lot of successes, when you fail, it feels worse, I think. But if you've done it, if you've nailed it a bunch of times, or you've written, then like you can have more like philosophical equanimity around like, oh, like I wasted a half a day, like kind of writing this thing or something, because you're like, that's going to end up being productive. And we'll also talk about that too. I think in one of the poems you asked me to talk about, we'll talk about this way to sort of like animate failure, and to turn that into the subject in a way. But like that's the next level. That's the next level. It's like not only to not get bummed out by it, but to actually see that as part of the creative process. Make quote unquote mistakes, if you want to call them that, or just like sort of, things that are like things that don't end up being at the center of the artistic process you're engaged in.
So you talked a second ago about hitting like what you call the cul-de-sac in the composition process. And
Very
just so
suburban metaphor, Brad, right?
I know, as I was going to say, but I feel like just to drill down into that a little bit more and to clarify for listeners, you're writing a poem and you hit a point at which you feel a little bit stuck or a little bit uneasy. And what characterizes one of these cul-de-sacs would be that the line itself or the moment in the poem is no longer generative for you creatively. Like you stop having language, or you stop seeing the images, or what is it?
It's funny because like I think of it almost as like I really think of it as like a lack of energy. Like I'm reading along and I can feel inside myself like my I'm like right here. I started to not want to read this anymore. This got boring for me. Not just boring, but like kind of like it feels devoid of any life. It's lifeless. And I know that's an analogy that's not helpful, whatever. But I use the analogy as did you play basketball when you were younger?
Sure, I grew up in Indiana.
And yeah, right. So I'm saying, so exactly what I'm talking about. So we grew up playing basketball on wooden floors. Like that's what I played hoops on wooden floors. And that part of the floor sometimes where you're dribbling and like it's just dead.
Yeah.
And you dribble and suddenly the ball just like doesn't bounce back.
Yeah.
That's how I think of those moments in a poem. It's just the ball doesn't bounce back. It's like there's just like a big thud. And you're like, I could sort of like explain why, probably. Like I could come up with like a kind of conceptual explanation for it, but it's a gut thing. Like I'm just like, nope, this isn't happening here. And sometimes you can work with it. You can try to like repair the whatever's going on with the wood floor, like that may be worth a little bit of effort, but a lot of the time the best thing to do is just back out of it. Just back yourself out, and be like, okay, wait, that was just 2 lines or 5 lines or 10 lines or whatever. Like there was a wrong turn somewhere. I'm going to back myself up. That's how I do it. I'm very linear with poems, because I think the experience of reading poems is linear. You're moving down the page or across or whatever's happening, you're like kind of going along. And so I think of it as like almost like a walk or like a movement through space. And I'm like, somehow I got to this point. Like that's just not happening. I don't know. I mean, again, I could talk about why, but it would be kind of in a way bullshit because it's just like
it's so personal.
And again, like you with writing and like so many people probably listening to this who've been doing it for a long time, like you just know, you're like, nope, this isn't happening. And that doesn't, that's fine. Just back yourself out.
Yeah. Well, I think like this is one of the frustrating elements of craft in any form of literature, is that so much of it is intuitive and so much of it is very specific to the writer. And I think that part of what being a skilled poet or a skilled novelist or whatever it is comes down to is developing that muscle, like that ability to like recognize your own work
Right.
for what it is, and to see when
Hard.
it's not working.
And that's the great thing about being in workshop. It's not so much what other people tell you about your work. It's when you're reading other people's work and you see the moment, you're able to see like, wait, this was so great up until this point. And then like, what decision did this person make that sort of made things start to like kind of go away from where the most energetic center of, of the poem was. And then other people can talk about that, or they can disagree with you, or they can be like, oh yeah, I think that's too. And and it's almost like, talking about someone else's work is the most helpful thing about being in a workshop, I think, rather than just sort of sitting there and like kind of receiving opinions or whatever, which can be helpful. But I mean, I just want to say I want to try to say something really practical for people who are want to write poems or trying to write poems right now, which is the probably the most important thing I do as a teacher is I give people, like, when they reach that point of impasse and they can't move past it, or they do move past it and the poem starts to feel like the dead spot on the floor. It's either way, right? There's that moment, there's that line. I think that when you're a less experienced poet, you tend to have maybe one or two solutions at that moment, like things that you can do, moves basically that you can do at that point. Because I've been doing this so long and I've read so many poems, I have literally hundreds of things that you can do at that moment. Like, and so I can be like, well, why don't you try this? 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 And again, it's like the rat trying to get the cheese. It's like you might have to try 5 or 10 or 20 different things, like contradict yourself, like talk about a totally different subject, like pull the most interesting word from the past 5 lines out and start your next line with that. Like, whatever, some practical, very almost like kind of like procedural based way to open your mind. And then, that tends to get people going in more interesting directions. And that again, as an instructor, it's not that I'm more talented. It's just that I've been doing it so long that I have way more solutions way more clubs in my bag, again, to use a sport metaphor,
That's interesting.
And I can show that to people. I can give that to my students, like I'd be like, okay, how many solutions do you want? I'll give you 1,000 and you just try them all, you'll come up with something.
I love this word procedural. I mean, there is an element of procedural behavior to the writing process.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious to know, because this is definitely something that happens for novelists. It certainly happens for me. I think it can happen for memoirists as well, these longer form prose projects. But I'm wondering if the same is true for you in poetry, where you start out on this like project of inquiry and you start to put lines on the page and you start to sort of get a sense of what the poem is about. But then eventually maybe you come to realize something that you might be avoiding. Like I'm often like sort of shocked, but also it's kind of funny in a way. You're like, wow, I thought I had such great self-knowledge. And then I'll realize like deep into a project that this big thing that needs to be said is not being said, and I've somehow been avoiding it. Or you'll get that feedback from a workshop or from somebody who reads it, and they'll ask you a question and make you realize like, oh yeah. Does that happen for you in poetry?
Yeah, I think maybe sometimes, that's really what's going on is they have the unconscious sense that they're getting close to something that's dangerous to say, and maybe it wouldn't actually be that dangerous to say it, like, but you feel like it's dangerous to say it, like maybe it's something about how you really feel about someone or something, or maybe it's a scary thought you have and you feel superstitious about saying it, or, there's lots of things, and I think that you can, that's a lot of the time when a poem gets obscure, like it's because somebody, and as a teacher, you have to be like, okay, actually this person is not ready to say what they have to say yet. So haranguing them about making this clear is like psychologically maybe like almost like a kind of violence, just let it sit, point it out that it's a little obscure there, and be patient. So many people come along to what they need to come along to. But yeah, no, I totally agree with you. Like that is definitely that's definitely something that happens to me. I'm like, oh shit. I didn't know I was going to say that. Like that's scary, but
And
it's
that's
okay.
where the work gets interesting
And
usually for
usually
the
it's
reader.
fine. And usually it's fine. As it's fine. Nothing. It's very hard to shock anybody, I mean, if you're, not a sociopath or something, I mean, I mean, if you are, hey,
There have been
sorry,
sociopathic poets, I'm sure, right?
plenty. Shelley was a sociopath for sure. But a great poet,
Yeah.
but yeah, total sociopath.
So I think it would be great to hear you read a poem from your new collection, and then we'll
Sure.
kind of try to unpack it
Yeah,
and take it apart a little bit as a way of
for
teaching
sure.
people how these things get built.
Yeah, yeah. Did you you had mentioned you wanted to talk about jury duty? That was one of the ones yeah. I mean, all I'll say is that, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of those poems that begins with a kind of subject, I guess, or not even a subject, but just like a phenomenon of literally jury duty, and just sort of wanders around in it for a while, looking for something to say, that's interesting, kind of just what's, and just as a poet, I just had the sense that if I stayed in this summons, figurative and literal, for a little while, that I would get to something that was new, that I hadn't said before. I didn't know, when I did it, I was like, well, maybe I'll just write this thing and I'll work on it for 6 hours or 2 days or whatever. And it'll just end up being stupid, which is a lot of the time that's what happens. And then I just throw those poems away. But that was not what happened in this case. Okay. So you want me to read it or?
Yes, please.
Okay. So this is Jury Duty. It's from the new book. Okay. Jury Duty. I wanted to waste the day not making lists, refusing to watch the final episode of Democracy on a screen attached to a mysterious silver box issued by an institution whose proboscis I willingly inserted into my soul so I can produce these endless, translucent complaints. Oh, whoever you are out there laughing on the street, I will give you my name, which has, in these long hours, grown less precious than a shadow. Take it and go forth without my confusion. I do not know which candidates won't dress us in uniforms, though it's true, it would be one fewer decision. No more staring into the endless darkness of the closet with its bulb that burned out 1,000 years ago. Where did I put my headlamp? I last saw it in a drawer, poured in the final frantic moments into a box no one labeled, stuff that will be utterly vital only once. We moved onto this hill, and I no longer can find anything not useful. I like to stare in the mirror and see an explorer who convinced the king of maps to let him sail off the edge, leaving me here to doze on the couch until the bus summons me with its hiss. I have at last been called. I finally feel ready to ignore all the evidence. I put on my robes, powder my wig, step into my long, pointed shoes, and go, holding my unforgiving gavel, into the innocent world.
So, in the tradition of the great 9th century Chinese poets, the jury duty poem.
Yeah, yeah. Actually, yeah, that's a whole other subject. But they had a lot of interaction with official, kind of bureaucracy, and that they were sort of a lot of time that was kind of the only job you could have. So they would try to get these jobs, sort of working for the bureaucracy, and so they have to take all these exams and stuff, and then get summoned by some official, minor bureaucratic official and grovel or whatever. So these great poets kind of trying to pass tests.
Well, I love a poem that finds the poetic in places and spaces that don't seem like, at least on the surface, to have that sort of action, but here you are ruminating on jury duty and finding a lot to say about it, and finding, I think, really interesting associations and bigger picture questions about society and our maybe cultural and political space that we are, existing through?
Yeah, I mean, I think it starts in, again, like in light of our discussion that we had. I think it starts in kind of like a pretty, hopefully familiar way. It's like I had these plans for the day. I had, like, and I'm sort of being kind of semi-comical about, the plans. Like, I wanted to waste the day not making lists. Basically, that's how it starts, or like, not watching stuff on my computer screen about how close we are to the end of our democracy, like that's sort of like, that was my plan for the day. Right. But instead I got to go down to the courthouse, and go to jury duty. Basically, that's kind of like the beginning impulse of the poem. And it's like, is that particularly promising? Like, I don't know. Like it's potentially interesting. Sort of like I wanted to do this, but I have to do that. Like that's kind of the basic dynamic. And like it's one I think most of us can kind of like connect with. And it's sort of neutral. It could be interesting, or it could just be sort of not interesting. And it's kind of like, so the language of the poem in the beginning is kind of like just sort of enjoying, characterizing like what a lazy day would look like for me, and then I get to kind of throw this shot in at at the school I work for about, they gave me, they give you a computer when you, so like, I sort of treat them like this monster that puts that I've allowed it to put its proboscis into my soul to suck out all the energy.
Wait, proboscis. Define
Right.
proboscis, because I flag that word, and I think this happens often in a poem, is that it will throw out a word like proboscis, and I'll stop and just sort of like look
Isn't it
at
like
it.
doesn't it insect? It's like a way of like sucking nectar, or like bees, or I don't know. I actually have no idea. But like it's kind of like, it's a way of like extracting something, like it's insects, or extract something from either a plant or from a animal. I've actually never looked it up. I just have this kind of sense of what it was like. So the implied metaphor is that somehow the institution I work for is a giant insect that's sucking, the nectar out of my soul or whatever. And that's another thing. But so I think the funny thing about poets, like, or the fun thing about writing poetry, is like you can totally go overboard, like constantly. Whereas like writing other things, it's like a little harder, but you can really just like completely exaggerate. Like that's obviously like totally inappropriately self-pitying drama. It's like, it's just a job, like they're not that bad, but like, but it's like, I allow myself to kind of get a little worked up about it for the sake of comedy there.
So you talk about like inquiry, and you talk about beginning by just wanting to kind of describe this experience of having plans to do one thing, but then having to do another thing. And as you started to write and continued to work on the poem, like how did that inquiry change? And like, did your understanding of the poem shift at a certain point?
Well, I didn't really have any understanding of the poem. And I think that, as I was writing it in this particular poem, and I think that, just to point to, again, like one kind of early moment, the poem starts with this sort of potentially kind of windy remark about democracy, the final episode of Democracy on the screen. I mean, it's fine, but like if you kind of went on in that vein, you'd start to sound a little bit like somebody posting on Twitter or whatever you call it now, like look at us, we're just watching as everything falls apart. It's like we've heard that a lot. Like I'm not sure that's why people are reading my poems, to hear me lecture them that our democracy is in danger, but I think there's a moment in the poem. So I kind of do that, and then I complain about my job a little bit by comparing it to a giant insect sucking the nectar out of my soul. and then I'm like, but then there's this. I think the tactic that I use, and again, if I were talking to a student, I might suggest this is one of many possible tactics. And I'd say, I ground myself in the present moment. The poem then talks about hearing some voices out on the street. So instead of continuing subject wise with what I was talking about for another 5, 10, 15, 20 lines of like about democracy or about my job or about how exploitative everything is or how privileged I am or whatever, like in that kind of subject matter, I shift and say this thing about, oh, whoever you are out there laughing on the street, I will give you my name. Like that's like I veer off and ground myself in a moment of actuality in the present, like of actually sitting there and listening as I'm writing. And I think that's like something that, poetry is particularly, that's that putting that moment in the poem. It's particularly available in poetry. It's harder to do it in other things. Like if you're writing a scene, it's in a novel, it's tough to stop and say, like, talk about what's going on with yourself right at that moment as a writer. Whereas it seems way more natural when you're writing a poem, because the form is so flexible.
I was going to say the word velocity was coming to mind. Like you can really move quickly in a poem.
Right. Yeah, you just veer off and you're just like on a different subject. Boom, boom, boom. Of course, that can get too. You can do that too much, and it can start to feel like there's no grounding. So it's like kind of like, yeah, it's a matter of, again, that could be another problem with the poem is you feel like you've got, you've given your toddler like the channel clicker, and you're like just like, whoa, stop switching channels for like 1 second, like but like I yeah, in this case I just had the sense, I think probably that like I don't want to give a lecture about democracy. It's like nobody needs that from me.
Yeah, I think lectures in literature tend to be a bad idea.
I like reading a lecture.
But, reading a lecture, but like when you have a character in a novel who starts to get up on a soapbox or something, that can be dicey.
Yeah, unless you're going to make fun of them, I think. Yeah.
So when you got to, like, how did you know when you got to the end of this one? Like, what did that look like?
I mean, I was moving around, and this just kind of like just trying to be true to this sense of like resistance to what I was supposed to do. Basically, that's essentially kind of like what, like I'm trying to be present in this sort of like dreading of assuming my responsibilities. I mean, that's what everybody does when they get that little jury duty slip, right? They just try to get out of it.
Right.
People.
right.
Or like postpone it. That's what I always do is I postpone it. And then I always get that notice. It's like, you've postponed this too many times. Like now you can't anymore. And I'm like, one more time. Please. Then it's like, okay, I'm going to do it, and like, so the whole poem is kind of like me just delaying. I was going to take the bus, like where I live, the courthouse in Oakland, it's like hard to park down there. So I take the bus, I would take the bus down there. It's just easier. And so I'm like, okay, I got to get to the bus by like whatever it is, 8:42 or something. And like, I just, I'm gonna put this off as long as I can. But at some point and then I think I had the sense in the poem that eventually I was going to have to get to that moment of leaving the house. And when I did, I sort of had this kind of funny thing where I sort of imagined myself as like kind of like a one of those like British jurists, or maybe like a colonial jurist, where I was like, I'm going to put my powder my wig. I'm like again, like exaggerating. Like if I'm gonna be the jury, I'm gonna think of myself as like kind of like I'm gonna dress like one of those judges that you see like in the UK, like with the robe and the powdered wig and everything, and like I'm really pointed shoes. I don't know why pointed shoes, but like somehow like my gavel. I'm gonna go with a gavel. I think I had this image. It'd be kind of funny to show up for jury duty dressed like that. Like really ready to do it. Like if you're like fuck if you're only gonna fucking drag me here, like I'm gonna come fully equipped,
Right.
To like make some big judgments,
But I think what you're saying, and I think this is worth underlining, is that absurdity and humor in poems is great. I love that.
Oh yeah.
And I think like poetry that totally lacks it, or a collection that totally lacks it, tends not to resonate as much. I think it's good for readers generally to have a little bit.
Totally. And I had this rule for myself writing this book at some point. I mean, this is a poem I probably wrote, kind of like halfway through or something. But I was like, every poem's got to have some moment of like humor or levity or something in it. Like this is just too much. We're like so weighed down by everything. I mean, I walk around wearing all the time. I text you, like, like we're gonna lose, whatever. We're gonna lose the colony on Mars, whatever. Like, yeah. So I was just like, I gotta lighten up, man. And so I wanted to. I sort of had a rule, and another rule I had was the poem's not done until there's some moment in it that I just can't like explain. I can't paraphrase. It doesn't mean that it's obscure to a reader in the sense of like semantically obscure, like it doesn't like make sense when you read it, but like that if you asked me, like I couldn't tell you like oh, really, this is actually about something else. You know, there has to be at least one moment, if not more, like that in the poem. You know, and that's just what I was looking for. So in terms of it being done, I think in this case that this poem happens to have a kind of circularity to it, where it's like I'm actually like leaving the house at the end of the poem, and that sort of like feels like the end. I suppose it could have kept going, but like it just feels a little bit like scene, you know. But you know, that's not always the case in a poem. A lot of the time, it's just like you're just like it's like a mic drop. A lot of the time, you know.
So I want to have you read another poem from the
Sure.
collection. I think this one's called "Failed Elegy."
Yeah. So this one was one of the final poems that I wrote for this book, and it kind of has an interesting genesis or unusual genesis, I guess. But I don't know. Would you rather I read the poem first, and then we can talk about that? Maybe that's better. So this poem, have you ever, Brad? Have you ever scattered someone's ashes?
I have not.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think I have. I think, you know, I've been to a lot of funerals, but usually it's like a burial.
Yeah. Yeah. I hadn't either. I had never actually scattered someone's ashes before. And my friend, the poet Dean Young, passed away a few years ago, and he had very specific instructions about what he wanted to do with his ashes. Like he wanted them scattered in a certain spot on a hike that he and his former wife used to go on, and like, you know, in a certain particular place. And so a bunch of us went on this pretty long hike. It was like a 10-mile hike, and took his ashes with us and then scattered them. And so this poem is like kind of sort of the occasion of this poem is that scattering of ashes, but we can, you know, and Dean Young was a great poet, and he died too early and too young. But only other thing I'll mention is that he had a heart transplant, you know, when he was younger. So I mentioned that as well, like in the poem, but okay. Failed Elegy. It seems these days every poem is a failed elegy for the world. Each one asks correctly, what good did writing this do? I cannot deny I often feel anger at the similarities between me and an oil company, especially on what is once again the hottest day ever recorded. It is so easy to do nothing except lament our success at writing useless laments. I must confess, I too once wrote a ridiculous elegy for a broken nail clipper. I said it caught the light of a distant star, where beings look down on us, disappointed, yet hopeful. We will, like poets, put things in the right order just in time. The clipper emitted a confusing, not very mysterious blue light. Sometimes it seems to me the job of a poet is mostly to rearrange the deck chairs next to a perfect blue swimming pool, then in those chairs to doze. In another failed elegy, I described how all day we walked through mist to get to the exact spot where Dean specified we should disperse his ashes. It was windy, and we got a lot of him on our hands. In the poem I wrote, he shares the name of a chef at Infinity Hospital, which sounds like, but is not, a beautiful lie. Then I wrote, when I imagine how he must have felt to try to write poems with a new heart he got from someone younger, I feel mine fill with the echo of replacement, which was not exactly, or perhaps too true. The truth is, I walked along through the mist, thinking many boring things, not feeling like much of anything except stopping. We walked through a field of wildflowers that left some yellow powder on our shoes. I just wanted to be home with my wife and son, but the mist really did seem endless. Unlike death, it was not. We drove slowly through the little town until we found a place to eat and did not speak of death. Speaking of death, Emily Dickinson compared herself to the little wren because she knew it was small and unremarkable. It sings the most notes, and sometimes will take a ride for a little while to eternity in the overcoat of a passing stranger.
So that's lovely. And I think, I guess you could call it a grief poem or some sort, like it's an elegy, right? So, or a failed elegy, but it's just an example of how poetry can offer a writer an opportunity to grapple with something that's difficult and a little bit ineffable and mysterious. I guess I'm just stating the obvious, but there's a long tradition, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, and I mean, this isn't, a new idea, but like every elegy is inherently a failure. I mean, what do you really want to do? Whatever you're trying to do when you're writing an elegy, it's never enough in the face of like the actual loss. It's always going to be a failure. Like in the same way that all words are going to be a failure in the face of like any real experience, So, but that doesn't mean that they're not useful in their failure, and it's a failure in the sense that, whatever the agenda is, to bring the person back, to remember them fully, to really encompass an experience of loss or something, it's just never going to be that thing. So what happened with this poem is that I tried to write it a bunch of times. And so unlike the first poem we talked about was like really kind of like I just was sort of kind of going line by line, saying that thing about the rat and the cheese, the maze. Like I was kind of just like moving through the maze, like with my nose, like where's the cheese, like, but this poem is different because I literally had probably like 7 or 8 poems that didn't work, like kind of spread out in front of me. And I was like, okay, like what's not happening here? Like and I would just take the parts out. Like in a way I took like the worst parts out and I mentioned them in the poem. Like I really did write a poem about a broken nail clipper, which is like as bad an idea as it sounds. And it was so ridiculous. But it wasn't even like funny. That's the thing. It was just like sort of self-serious and like silly. It was just bad. But there was, but like kind of but like somehow talking about how I couldn't write that poem felt like in the spirit of this poem, I guess. Like, so I talk about, writing it. I once wrote a ridiculous elegy for a broken nail clipper. Like, it's kind of like, it's like that, like impulse to try to memorialize something that's so small is like somehow also feels like in the spirit of loss, right? Because we're always losing everything. Like as Elizabeth Bishop said, the art of losing isn't hard to master. Like it's like, cause we're always losing everything all the time. So that is part of it too. Like wanting to be like, we're in a constant state of loss. And so I don't know. So I just was taking like little bits and pieces from these failed poems and even referencing earlier drafts of this poem. Like that thing about, at some point out of desperation, I think I Googled Dean's name to see if there were other Dean Youngs. And there happened to be some guy who was like a chef at a hospital called Infinity Hospital. And I was like, this is like, so like, this sounds like a Dean Young poem. Like saying somebody's a chef at Infinity Hospital. It's like, it sounds like a line from one of his poems. And I was like, this is crazy. Like, how is this possible? And so it's like, and so in the poem, I talk about how like, it sounds like I'm making something up, but I'm actually not, like, so it's just, it's just kind of like trying to like talk about all the different approaches to try to grieve someone or memorialize their loss or their passing, and then this walk I went on, just trying to talk about the truth of the matter is a lot of the time I was cold and bored, even though it was like this momentous occasion. I was like, it was sort of like what we were talking about earlier about like when you're in the museum, right? And you're like supposed to be having a big experience. Well, I even felt that on that hike. There was hours where I was like, I wish I was home, like watching Netflix with my wife. Like, I don't want to be here, like hiking through, slogging through this like misty landscape, like, getting ready to throw my friend's ashes into the fucking ocean, Yeah. Like, I just don't. It's then, it had nothing to do with missing him or not missing him. It's just, I was tired and hungry.
Grieving is like inherently flawed. Like we notice there's no right way to do it. No one ever gets it right. No one ever nails it. Like at a funeral service or some sort of speech, like it's always imperfect. And I think the fact that you sat down, I think that the way that you portrayed the creative process for this poem, where you're sitting in front of all of these failed versions of poems and then built this poem about failure out of those failures, that has a certain creative logic to it that's really brilliant.
Right.
And then
for the reason you said. It's like the whole thing is a failure. like failure to grieve correctly, failure to live correctly, failure to really be a great friend. No matter how good friend you are, like when someone dies, you almost always feel like, oh, I should have like said this, or I should have been more there. It's not, I mean, maybe there's circumstances where you don't feel that way, but most of the time, most people do,
Sure.
like, I should have been a better son. I should have been a better this, and like, that's also part of it. Just like failure. And it's like, what can we make of failure? What can we make of that? And that's the artistic question too. It's like, what can we make of this? What can we make of this inadequacy? And can we have a sense of humor about it? Can we have a sense of appreciation for it? Can we find commonality? I mean, that's something that's just been so disturbing over the past years. And even more recently, it's like, there seems to be no way for people to connect around their failures. We're all constantly failing to be the people we want to be. And it's like, and there's no room for that. It's like to be in process. But in poems, there is actually, you can. And I love being in process in poems. And hey, people can take it for what they want. If they don't like it, or they think I'm like they can do it better, then okay. But like I'm going to be exactly who I am in these poems.
Well, and it's also calling to mind something that I think you and I have talked about before. I want to say I even included this line in my novel, the part that you appear in, where we talk about putting the problem in the poem.
Yeah, which is what Bob Haas said. So Robert Haas said that exactly. And that's exactly what I did. So Robert Haas said that, put the problem in the poem. And what he meant by that, and this is great advice for poetry, but it's great advice for any form of arts, is when you're struggling with something in your work of art, it's like, I can't properly describe this room, let's say, in a novel, whatever. Like, literally write that down. Like, I can't describe this room, and then try to say why it is, like what is keeping you from doing it. And that really is actually probably at the center of what's important about the writing, and it's so incredibly practical. The advice is incredibly practical and wise to do that. And whether you leave those moments in or you take them out or whatever, they'll bridge you to the next thing, but this whole poem is that.
Yeah, but it's like the funny thing, the ironic thing or whatever is that it's very practical advice, and it makes a lot of sense once you've done it and you sort of are, looking back with the benefit of hindsight. But I find that sometimes the problem that you're supposed to put in the poem, or the problem that you're supposed to put in the short story or the novel or whatever it is, there can be resistance to doing it. It can seem like the problem when in fact contains the solution.
Exactly. Well, that's the whole point. And I think that it's really, again, like, to try to be really practical about this. I don't mean sit there and do all this kind of psychological analysis. I mean, literally write down what it is you can't do in the most basic way. I can't figure out what to say next. I feel like I'm being boring here. I don't feel like I'm telling the truth. I feel like I've mischaracterized this person. I feel like there's something that's hidden from me. And it's like magic. If you literally write the words down, type them or write whatever process you use or something, like you actually insert them into the text, the next thing that happened, it will draw you back into kind of like an honesty and attention as you try to answer your own question. I mean, you may not answer the question, you probably won't, but at least it'll bridge you to the next thing. And it really sounds so basic, but honestly, that's also in office hours. That's 95% of what I do in office hours. I literally, this is what I do, Brad. I say, my students having trouble. They're like, I don't know what to do here. And I'm like, and I very quietly take out a little piece of paper and notebook, or I have it right next to me. And with that, I'm still looking at the student. I'm like, what do you think, what's hard for you about this moment? And then I start transcribing what they say. Like, I literally write down every single word they say. And then I hand them the paper and I say, read that after you get to the part of the poem you can't write anymore. And then read what you said. This is what you said. And it's like, usually the lines are in there. It's crazy. It's cause the thinking that needs to be done is somehow you're forbidding yourself from doing it because you think it sounds too stupid or you sound too basic or whatever. And like, no, actually it's all in that language there. And I've had to train myself to do that. And I'm always forgetting to do it, but that's kind of what I got to in this poem. It's like, I could just talk like I could talk through the problem basically.
Yeah.
And there's one thing I want to say about this poem, which is that the end of the, so I read this poem to my wife. We were sitting on the couch in our living room, and I read it to her, or I showed it, I handed her the paper, and then we kind of read it together. And she was like, the end of this poem isn't quite right. And I was like, you're right. It's not. There's something off about it. I don't know what it is. And so we sat there and we talked it through together. We tried a bunch of things or whatever. And then so this kind of arrived. I think the original ending was something like, it sings the most notes and sometimes we'll take a ride for a little while on the overcoat of a passing stranger. Like it didn't have that word eternity in it. And she and I played around, and then eventually the word eternity was mentioned, which is very connected with Dickinson. So it kind of makes sense that it would have come to one of our minds. And then we played around with how to exactly write the line and where to put that word at the end, very end of the poem or a little bit earlier, whatever. And so we kind of co-wrote the end of this poem. And that was actually the last poem that I wrote for this book. And it was the last poem in the book, although Brenda Hillman suggested I switch it with the poem that's currently not at the end, which I think she was right about. But Sarah, my wife, Sarah, helped me with the end of this poem, so that's another part of the process. Is sometimes you need someone else to talk through it with you if you can't quite get it right.
Yeah, it makes me feel a little bit of like a sense of vindication that I landed on this poem as a poem of interest, because it does feel like it encompasses a lot of the other poems in the collection. It feels like something you were building towards.
Yeah. And I think totally. And I think that, you learn something as you're writing a book. I don't know, this from writing your own novels, like any form of writing, you're learning something, you're kind of, and I feel like there's something about this book that I learned something about how to talk in a way that felt very direct and honest to me. But I think I learned that in every book I write as I'm going on. So yeah, often the final poems will be, kind of the apotheosis of that recognition or realization in me, of like how I wanted to be talking all along. And so, yeah, I think you're right to, I haven't really had much of a chance or occasion to talk about these poems very much. So it's been like, it's been fun to talk about it with you. Cause like, I'm realizing a lot of things as I talk about them too,
Sure. Well, and I want to, this is a question that's not necessarily tied explicitly to craft when it comes to making poems, but it is something I want to ask you about because it's of interest to me as a writer generally. Mm-hmm. And it has to do with the way that poetry works on me creatively. I find as a writer of prose that if I read poetry before I sit down to write, it tends to be helpful. And it has a kind of opening effect on whatever part of my brain has to do with language. And I'm just wondering if like that is something that you feel as well, or if you have thoughts as to why, because I don't think I'm alone in that. I think like the ritual of maybe reading a poem or two before you get into trying to write your novel or whatever, I think that could be very helpful. And I think there's something particular that poetry does with language that may activate or loosen something in me.
Well, I think it comes down to probably to at least two things. I mean, one is, and I'm kind of curious who there are poets who you particularly go to when you're in very much desperation, but like, I think that the one thing is a kind of precision / slowness / presence in language itself. Like the unit of thought of a poem is so basic. It's almost at the syllabic level. It's not really, I mean, of course the words mean things, but it's like, it's practically down to the smallest possible unit of meaning you can have. And I think like as a writer, it's almost like, like if you exercise and you warm up, you just try to do the motions that you're going to be doing later, but you do them slow, you do them with intention, you do them, kind of to try to warm up your body. And the same way as a writer, you're like, when you read a poem, if you're down at the most basic level of the word or even the syllable, like that's like where poems live. So then when you come back up to the bigger kind of like when you're going to grapple with the big dragon of like concepts and stuff and characters and scenes and settings, that like you've still got in you this kind of focus on the words that keeps you from just sort of drifting into banality of thought or received thought, And I think that's one of the things. And then, yeah, just maybe even just like a kind of, that related to that is what we've been talking about the spirit of inquiry. Like, and it's like that. I think all writers want to hold on to that, you know, even if they know what they want to say, they still want to discover things as they're writing, you know, and that's, you know, the great poems are always discovering something. And so I think those two things are like very good things to carry into any form of art at all, actually. Like, I know a lot of artists who do musicians or painters or, you know, whatever, who do the same thing. They'll read a couple poems before they do their thing. It's just some about the pace of it and the kind of like way it orients you towards reality that feels opening, like you said. You know, I think that's right.
Yeah.
And finally, I just say, man, poems listen. They're listening machines. And we are always, I mean, it's so hard to listen. So hard to ask questions. I said the other day, I was at a event with Brenda Hillman, and I was like, the internet turns every question into a statement, you know? And it's like, God, it's exhausting. And to be with somebody who's really just asking questions, like, honestly, you know, that's like, that is just, it's a relief, you know?
So I want to close by talking about being a poet. Because I think there could be people listening who love poetry, who like want to write poetry, but who might be a little bit shy about calling themselves a poet. It's like, it's quite a thing to like call yourself, right? It's like, at what point do you identify as a poet? And like, how do you, like, is there a struggle that you went through to feel yourself worthy of the title? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, what is it that gets a person from that initial enjoyment of poetry to like dabbling and writing a, you know, poetry of their own, to like actually publishing poetry and being like, yeah, this is me, I'm a poet?
I still feel silly when I say it sometimes. I mean, I think like, you know, it feels kind of like grandiose or something. And in some social situations, you know, like if it's hanging out with other parents or, you know, just some social situation, I'll kind of do everything I can to avoid saying that. Like, cause it just, I don't want to sound pretentious. So I think unfortunately there's just some legacy of that word. It's like, that isn't the same as saying you're a writer. Writer feels more like kind of like, I got ink stains on my finger. I'm like, I'm a working man, you know, like the poet somehow seems like, hello.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, I think, you know, finding other poets helps, because then you can kind of like, you got your gang and you're like, okay, yeah, I'm like, I know we're like a bunch of weirdos who like, you know, will get obsessed about like a Pantone for like 3 days or something, but like, it's okay. Like you can sort of gather strength in your community. It's tough to be out there alone in the world as a poet, you know? But yeah, no, I don't know. And I mean, as far as whether or not I don't think whether or not you've published, it sort of gives you more right to call yourself a poet or not. Like, I think it's if you're actually doing it or not. Are you really practicing it? Are you really working? And when you are, you're a member of this like ancient tribe, you know, it's existed for as long as languages existed, and you can put yourself in a lineage, like going all the way back to the first uses of language. And, you know, just that, take solace in that. If that word poet sounds kind of dorky, like, remember, you know, like you're in a tradition, you know? And so there's nothing to be ashamed of. You're like in a guild, basically. And like, we're all in the same guild. And if I ever meet a fellow poet, I'm just like, it doesn't matter if they publish nothing or publish 1 million books. Like, we're in the same tribe. We're in the same guild, you know, and we're all working in the same area. And it's just like, you're cool with me and I'm cool with you, you know? So,
well, I think that
out there, I'm cool with you, poets.
Well, I think that's a great place to end. This has been super interesting and helpful, and I appreciate you taking the time to kind of break this all down with me, and congratulations on the new collection.
Thanks, Brad. I've always loved talking to you about writing, and like, I just feel like it's just, yeah, I feel like you ask the best questions, and just like, it's really cool. It's cool what you do. So thank you.